Dr. Christopher Tollefsen. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me to be on your podcast.
Yeah, an absolute pleasure. Um, so one of the ways I found you was you wrote a book called Christian Ethics and Lying, or Lying in Christian Ethics.
That's right.
So I want to kind of dive into morality and to start with the foundations of morality.
Yeah, sure. That's great. And morality is obviously about acting, right? It has to do with questions about acting. How should I act? How should I
Mm,
live? And so I think it is helpful in thinking about the foundations to start with what makes action possible, motivating, desirable for us, right? There's all sorts of things that I could do. I could pick up a cup or I could throw something across the room. Those are all possibilities. What turns something from a possibility into an opportunity, right?
mm,
That makes it something that I could then act for the sake of. And I think the answer to that is that I have to see whatever it is that's a possibility is offering some sort of good, some sort of benefit, whether it's to me or to somebody else. So I think the foundation of morality is actually in our grasp of a variety of different, what would call basic goods, goods such as friendship, life and health, personal
mm,
integrity, religion, I would include knowledge, aesthetic experience. These are all goods that we recognize practically as aspects of human fulfillment and human flourishing, and that we can pursue for their own sake. We don't always have to pursue knowledge for the sake of something else. Sometimes you might take a class just because you're interested in the subject matter.
right.
Obviously, you can't be friends with somebody just for the sake of somebody else, right? If you're doing that, then you have no actual friends. You have to be friends with the person for their own sake and for the sake of the friendship. And so I think there are a number of these basic human goods. And I think that raises a moral question for us. Given that there are all these goods and that they create for us all kinds of opportunities, not just possibilities, but opportunities for action. I could stay and have this discussion with you, which, pursuing the good of knowledge and clearly the good of sociability. We haven't met before, but we're actually engaged in the formation of a relationship now in virtue of having this conversation with one another. Or I could go home and take care of my children, pursuing the goods of family, or I could go to a movie and pursue the goods of aesthetic experience. How is it that we make those choices? How is it that we should make those choices in the face of a wide variety of goods and all the different options that they create for us? I think that is the moral question.
Mm,
There's a long tradition of thinking that the way that we should make those choices is to maximize the good. I think that's very implausible. We could talk more about that if we wanted. We could get into the weeds of contemporary moral philosophy. But I think the bottom line is that we need to be fully reasonable in our choices, and that means being open to all of the goods and all of their goodness, and all of the beings for whom those goods are good, which includes at least all other human beings. That would
yeah.
just be the starting point for thinking about
Yeah.
morality.
Yeah. And it seems to me that morality must have a standard. You're talking about good, and we have to kind of define, okay, what do you mean by good? Good for whom? Good to whom? Good on what timeline? All of those questions need to be answered as well.
They do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, again, from our own standpoint as acting beings, especially in childhood, as we're coming to an awareness of our capacity to act. And if you look at a kid, the way a kid acts, kids are always, they're sticking their fingers in everything. They're trying to find out everything that they can. They're asking questions, right? If you've been around a child who is able to speak, then they start going into the why. And at some point, it seems to me that they come to realize that this thing that they're doing, this asking of questions and getting answers and coming to understand something, are itself there. These are instances of a wider form of what we could call the good of knowledge or understanding. And they come to recognize that it's not just a good for them, it's not just valuable for them, it's not just an aspect of their own well-being, but it's an aspect of the well-being of other beings that are relevantly like them. Right? Probably first they think only of their parents and their siblings, but if
Mm,
they're well formed and they are practically, intelligent and reasonable, then they're going to eventually come to recognize that includes all the other beings that are like them, not just their parents, not just their friends, not just their siblings, but all human
right.
beings.
Right. Yeah. Um, that does not sound in it doesn't sound very imposing if that makes sense. Like in other words, society imposes a morality, but there are those who stray outside of that morality. And as we're kind of defining what that morality is, there's that famous quote about law that if there is no punishment, then there is no law,
Right.
right? And so morality must be enforced, and so you have to kind of how would you define uh, good?
Well, good for us is what is fulfilling of human nature, right?
Mm,
And morality is being reasonable in the pursuit of all of the goods that are fulfillments of human nature, and that in being fulfillments of human nature contribute to human flourishing. So I actually think that the foundations of morality are oriented towards human flourishing and human fulfillment. They're not, their origins aren't to be found, for instance, in command, and certainly not in something like punishment just as such. There's obviously a need for command and punishment when we think about political morality and what it takes to
hmm
get people to act together as a polity. But just in terms of morality, I think the foundation is human flourishing, which makes morality naturally attractive in a certain way. That's not to say that it's not imposing in the sense that it makes, in some cases, very significant demands on us, and we'll get to some of those demands a little bit later in our conversation, I think.
hmm
But morality as such makes sense to us precisely because it offers us a path to human flourishing.
Mm. And the human flourishing has to be um, that's an interesting definition because if you think about someone going to war, for instance,
Mhm.
they are doing something which logically maybe doesn't make as much sense because they're not pursuing their own human flourishing, right? There's a high possibility that they're going to die in service of their country or in defending of their country or their homeland, and yet we see that as a great good. How do you kind of juxtapose
Yeah, that's a
those
great
two?
question. I think in at least the two ways, right? So one, our grasp of the goods and of the importance of human flourishing is again a grasp that goes beyond just what those goods are for me, right? I mean,
Mm,
I would not be able to recognize friendship or marriage as a good if I was only concerned narrowly with the good for myself, for
mm,
instance.
yep.
And so, given, I think, a proper love for one's country and for one's fellow countrymen, one can act for their sake and for the sake of their flourishing in going to war. But because my own flourishing is tied up with the flourishing of those whom I love, right? And grant that I have a properly ordered love towards the rest of the people in my country, then at a minimum, I could see that failure to act for their sake, right, in a way that's grounded in that love would be detrimental to my
Right.
flourishing, right? And I think people do have that thought. People going to war on behalf of their country or doing engaged in very self-sacrificial action on behalf of their family have the thought that their life would be made considerably worse if they were not doing what's needed for the good of their loved ones, for instance.
Right. Yeah. Their life or their loved ones' lives.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Chesterton has that famous quote, men do not go to war because they hate what's in front of them, but because they love what's behind them. I think
Yeah,
that's kind of
that's a great
what you're
quote.
getting at there.
Exactly.
When you're talking about human nature, that um, that we should be doing what is good and in accordance with our own human nature. Can you define more what that means? Because there are many humans whose nature, it seems, that seems like a somewhat superficial and um, not thoroughly tied down definition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it's a very formal understanding when you just say doing what is conducive to our flourishing is acting in accordance with our human nature. I think that's actually a benefit to the view that I hold more generally. Sometimes it goes by the name of the new natural law theory. Uh, on some accounts of natural law ethics, which is the general account of ethics that I accept, you
Mm,
investigate the nature of human beings, you investigate human nature, and then you draw moral conclusions from that. But I think we actually understand human nature in the relevant way by understanding what goods are good for us, right? When
right.
we come to understand that knowledge is a good for us, we're not making an inference from what we see about human beings and their behavior. We're coming to understand something about human nature and what fulfills human beings by coming to recognize that the fact that right now I could ask a question and get an answer to it is not just a possibility, but an opportunity for action for me. And I think that's
Right.
true across the range of the goods. That is how we come to understand a very important aspect of human nature, namely human nature insofar as it is available for human flourishing.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, yeah, I just because I'm coming at this because I'm a Christian, and so one of the things I believe is as Job mentions, that man is born to trouble as the spark flies upward, and that we are fundamentally our nature is broken and is in need of fixing and saving, uh, because of the fall, and I think because we have strayed from God, and I think that's when we're talking about a standard of morality, I think it's necessary to have an objective standard,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yep.
And I don't know, the good of human nature, the continuation of human nature, just seems a little bit too subjective. In that, like there are some people who would describe doing some things such as polygamy as the human nature, the nature of men is they want to have multiple wives, multiple women. But I would say that is wrong, but I would appeal to like an objective standard and not human nature. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. And again, remember that I'm not appealing to human nature. I'm, as it were, fleshing out the idea of human nature by way of a prior understanding of the goods that I think are constitutive aspects of human fulfillment, right? So I agree. There's all kinds of stuff in our given nature, all
Mm,
kinds of dispositions and emotions and passions that we have that do not work on their own for the sake of human flourishing, and in some cases run quite contrary to that. And I absolutely agree with you that from a larger religious Christian perspective, it's because of the fall that our passions are disordered in the way that they are. I think if we were just looking at the way human beings behave and trying to infer from that how they should behave, we would be in trouble, right?
mm,
And so I agree with you. There needs to be an objective norm, and that norm, on my understanding, is gained by thinking about what reason requires of us in the face of what I take to be genuine human goods, right? Not just the things that we happen to want, not just the objects of the passions that we happen to be feeling at one or another time,
mm,
right? But goods that really are fulfillments of human nature, and from a larger Christian perspective, fulfillments of human nature because they were created for us by God to be
mm.
our fulfillments, right? God couldn't
Right.
possibly have created us with no nature, right? There would be no
There'd be
us,
no us. Yeah.
right? And so having created us with a nature, there has to be, right? If God is creating us for our good and out of love for us, there has to be some difference between what it means to act in a way that is a fulfillment of that nature
Mm,
and conduces to our good, and what it means to act in a way that's not a fulfillment of that nature.
yeah.
I think we probably would agree on that. And it seems to me that the best understanding of how to, as it were, see God's plan for us is to think about the goods, the genuine goods that are aspects of our flourishing, and think about what it means to be reasonable in relationship to those goods.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree absolutely. And I think that the good must be defined. My only thing would be I think the good must be defined by God and not by us, because what was good in one age is not good in another age, and morality, as defined by human standard, changes over long periods of time. So there was a point when, for instance, it was okay for people would see it as morally acceptable, in fact, morally good to own slaves, and that is, I would say, wrong. Um, and we would all agree now that it is wrong. But if we are just going by what's good, I don't see how we could condemn the people of the past for participating in slavery, given that it was good in their time.
Mhm. Well, I think it's important to distinguish between morality, which is what, let's say, what reason recognizes as good and what the requirements of the good are when it's operating without error, right? And what we could call mores, which are what a particular society thinks of as good and thinks
Hmm,
of as the particular way to approach the good. And pretty clearly, every society makes errors of to varying degrees, right? It's part of being a responsible member of your own society, that you think critically about the mores of your society with a view to moving them in the direction of what genuine morality demands. And I think also pretty clearly the time that you live in and the extent to which, say, a corrupt mores has become embedded in a particular social world can make it really difficult for people to recognize that. Uh, I've spent a long time in my career writing about abortion, which I think is a great injustice to unborn children.
Mhm.
But we obviously live in a world in which, for a wide variety of reasons, incentives line up for people to deny that claim.
Mhm.
Right? It's contrary. The claim that I make, that's a claim about morality, is contrary to the mores of our time. But I don't think that doesn't mean that the good has changed, or that human nature has changed, or that human flourishing has changed. It means that, again, I think there's agreement between you and me. Um, Insofar as we're fallen, we're going to be subject to error, and sometimes to widespread error, right?
Right.
And insofar as those errors become culturally embedded, it becomes even more difficult for us to dig our way out of them.
Yeah.
That's I just think that's a different claim from saying that morality has changed or that the human good has changed.
Yeah, I do think that's an important distinction between social customs of a time versus an absolute good.
Yeah.
So an absolute good might be thou shalt not murder, but then a social though that's maybe a bad example. But there are some things that are absolute goods, and then we tack onto those some social customs as well, which is like you should open the door for ladies, right? That's a social good. And maybe an absolute good, but there are different ways of honoring women throughout time. Today we open the door for the ladies, right? So I think that's a great distinction to make. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that the new natural law that you mentioned?
Yeah, it is an understanding. It's based on an interpretation of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, talks about the first principles of practical reason being self-evident and not derived, and he identifies them as directives of practical reason. I mean, Aquinas thinks that reason can operate in two ways. It can operate in terms of trying to understand the way that the world is, or it can be directed towards action, right? And we talked about that a little bit earlier. And when it's
Mm-hmm.
directed towards action, it directs persons, right? Agents, people who are acting towards action by its directive to them to pursue certain goods, right? For Aquinas lists the good of life, good of knowledge, good of friendship. Um, I think that if you properly read his text, he identifies the good of marriage as a basic good, good of religion. And that's the starting point, right? That is, it's practical reasons, self-evident grasp of these goods as to be done and pursued,
Mm-hmm.
right? That is the starting point for human action. And then Aquinas is a little bit, I would say, unclear about how you get from there to moral norms. He does think that the norms of the Ten Commandments are derived from these first principles, these directives to pursue human goods in a very quick way that should be obvious to more or less everybody. And then he thinks that further down the road, there are other precepts that are precepts that only the wise could grasp. But he doesn't say a lot about how we get from those directives to pursue goods like life and friendship to commandments like the commandment not to kill or the commandment not to lie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the ways that we can do that, again, thinking about this from the standpoint of what does it mean to be reasonable, is to recognize, again, because of our fallen human nature, that very frequently we're led in the direction of acting on the basis of emotions or passions or desires that we have that aren't really well integrated with reason. And so if I was to act out of hostility to you and just and kill you for no reason, that would obviously be unreasonable. It would be
Mm-hmm.
contrary to the good. But I think it's also unreasonable for me to kill you in order to achieve some other purpose, right? Not out of hostility, but because I'm trying to pursue some other good. And I think it would also be unreasonable because it would fail to recognize the way in which these goods are goods, not just for me, but for you and for anybody who's relevantly like us. If I was to systematically privilege my pursuit of the goods over everybody else's,
Mm-hmm.
or the pursuit of me and my family over everybody else's, right? And
Yeah.
so I think a reasonable pursuit of the good has to be fair and has to be, in a very general sense, in pursuit of communion between all the beings that are capable of being fulfilled by these goods.
Hmm.
So that, I mean, I would say that the new natural law, the characteristic position of the new natural law with respect to morality is this grasp of the goods as directing us towards action, and then
Right.
an attempt to fill in how we get from that to moral principles like thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not lie or bear false witness. And one of the ways that we think that's helpful for doing that is by identifying very concretely the way that passions and desires that aren't integrated into reason can lead us away from what reason requires.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's an interesting. Where did Aquinas base? Did he just base the goods off of like when looking at society and history, we can see things that worked and that produced human flourishing, and so we mark that as a good, or did he have something else that he based it on?
Well, that's the interpretive question, right? There's the dispute right there. Some people think that Aquinas has a view according to which you look at human nature. I think that what Aquinas is suggesting in this particular passage, where he's talking about the first principles, is that if we think about how you and I came to understand that it's better to have friends than not to have friends, right? Or that it's better to be knowledgeable than to be ignorant,
Mm,
or that it's better to be a person whose various practical aspects of ourself are kind of tied together rather than coming
right.
apart all the time, right? We have in ourselves certain inclinations, Aquinas says, towards finding things out and towards, you know, communion with other persons. Um, and as we come to mature reflection on these, we can recognize the objects of these inclinations as both general and intelligible, right? So not just I'd like to be friends with you or I'd like to know the answer to this particular question, but I recognize friendship as a
Right.
good, right? I recognize knowledge as a good, and I recognize it not just as a good for me, but as a good for you and a good for all other human beings. So I think Aquinas is giving us a picture of how we come not to deduce these goods, but to have a kind of insight, a kind of practical insight into what's genuinely fulfilling for human beings. Right? He
Yeah.
could be wrong. He could be wrong. I could be wrong in my interpretation of Aquinas, but I think it's plausible, right? I do think that you see this in children that they come to have insight into these broader categories of goods, and they stop simply thinking about this particular thing or that particular thing, and come to have a more general understanding of what's worthwhile.
Right.
Friendship is something they start to want to be friends with not just the people that they are familiar with, but with they recognize this would be a good if I became friends with this person at school or even with that stranger.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Interesting. When Aquinas was thinking about this, because I know Thomas Aquinas was a Christian. I think
Mhm.
I don't remember which, he wrote some famous book that I've forgotten. But when he was thinking about this, was his what was what was the social foundation that he decided that, like, okay, I need to write this book because, like, was he seeing something in the world that made him think people need this?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, Aquinas is writing, I think, primarily for members of the clergy, right? And
Mm,
he's writing so that they will have a more informed. I mean, again, I think you need to think about the clergy at the time that Aquinas is writing as the primary educators of people,
right,
the primary people who are charged with sort of helping people to understand how it is that they should act and the reasons that they should act in ways that they should. And so Aquinas is writing his Summa Theologica in part as a sort of giant educational. It's like the largest instruction video for clergy ever written. And if you look at the Secunda Secundae, which is one of the large books within the 5 volume Summa, I think there you get like answers to lots and lots of practical questions.
mm,
Questions about war, questions about lying. That's where he discusses lying.
right,
Questions about restitution, questions about what you owe people in certain circumstances. And I think he is kind of synthesizing at the time that he's writing everything that he thinks has come to be understood as true by members of a kind of larger Christian community that's been in existence for 1,000 years or so. He thinks that you could give good philosophical reasons for these principles, but he also thinks they're what the church and Christianity at large has come, I think, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit to recognize as true as well. So there's a kind of synthesis of both theology and philosophy. There's also a synthesis that I think is related to this between Augustine and Aristotle. Aquinas is a tremendously synthetic thinker. I mean, he's just bringing together. He's thinking about the various Islamic philosophers that he's aware of and trying to see what they've said that harmonizes what he takes to be the truth. I think Aquinas thought plausibly that
Mm,
if there is a natural law, right, if there are truths of morality, that it would be crazy to think that human beings couldn't access them. Right? I
hmm
mean, what point would
right.
they? What point would they have? And so you should expect, although budgeting for fallen human nature and the way that we can go wrong, you should expect that even people at some distance from Christianity are going to have recognized something about the truth, so that you can
Right.
learn something, right, by thinking about even people who are at some distance from the Christian tradition, like the ancient Greeks, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, and I think
Yeah.
that makes Aquinas really just a great model for how to think about a wide variety of things, not just ethics.
Yeah, yeah, I do I like that as well. I do like the fact that he was looking at this saying like if you look at the world, the Bible tells us that you can find God in it and you can find this objective clues about the objective morality, right? We fundamentally know that I shouldn't murder you, that stealing your property is wrong, right? There's something ingrained within us. We have factory settings, and I like that Thomas Aquinas was um, starting with those and starting with these are the things we know um, that have worked throughout history. Yeah, I think that's very wise. I wonder though is that something that only works in a reasonable society? In other words, if you look at a culture, a place, a people that have gone very far astray from what we would consider normative, from what we would consider good. Um, Pulling them back, I don't know if pulling them back by the strings of this is not your human nature would work. I'm curious what you think of that because um, I think fundamentally it has to be grounded in God because He is outside of the system, and all standards within the system can and will change over time.
Yeah, so Aquinas thinks that morality is a matter of reason, right? And he thinks that reason is available to us simply as human beings, right? He does think that in a corrupt culture, it can be very difficult for us to recognize what's true. He would never deny that.
Hmm.
But I think he thinks that even in the most corrupt culture, right, there's still some opportunity for people to be brought around to the truth, right? Which is one of the reasons I think that if you look at Aquinas's writings, they're just chock full of argument, right? And he's given, right, he's committed to the value of reason, and he's committed to the value of arguing from premises of natural reason when you're arguing with people, for instance, who aren't Christians, right? Who don't agree, who don't accept a set of
Right.
Christian premises. I think that there's three possibilities here, where you mentioned two. One can
Okay.
try and, as it were, drag people back by way of reference to human nature. One can drag people back by reference to God. Or I think the third possibility, which is the one that I've been trying to articulate, is that one can, as it were, drag people back, right? One can make a pitch to people. One can engage in something that is practically convincing by appealing to their recognition of what's good, of what's fulfilling. I
Right.
think even amidst, right, many disagreements that we have, right. So again, to go back to the abortion case, right, I disagree with a lot of people, obviously, about this issue, but I
Yeah.
don't think that most of those people would deny that there's something valuable about life and about health,
Right.
right? Our disagreements are about whether early early human beings are in fact human beings, or whether early human beings deserve the same protections with regard to life, or in some cases about whether life itself is a basic human good, the way that I think it is, or whether it's only an instrumental good, right? So that if
Hmm.
it's not serving your other purposes, then it's no longer of any value. So I think there is some common ground there, even among people who have very significant disagreements. And I think Aquinas's counsel would be to argue from that common ground, right? To start there and then
Mm,
to make the case, right? And
yeah.
that in a certain way, it's by doing that that we then get to this larger question of God. Right? If there really are goods for human beings, if there really is a way that human beings ought to act that is conducive to human flourishing, I think that raises a natural question. Well, where did that come from?
Right.
Right. And there's an avenue to then talk about larger issues about our relationship to the divine.
Yeah. I might just add one thing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And as a side note, God bless you for your work in fighting abortion. We are all the way behind that, 100%.
All right.
So well done there. Thank you for your work. Um, but I would maybe add one thing, which is I believe that sin. The Bible teaches that sin makes people blind.
Mhm.
And so they're in a way that they cannot appeal to reason, they cannot understand reason, they cannot. Um, if you if you serve reason, eventually it will betray you. But if you submit the reason to God, then the Bible says that He will give it back to you 10, 30, and 100-fold, right? And so this I think that this is very wise to appeal to everyone's base knowledge, the factory settings, that this is good, this other thing is bad, and you must obey that good. We would say because God um, because God commands it. But I might also add that when people are so deeply in sin that God has given them up to it, sometimes they can't see the hole that they're in.
Yeah, I guess, there's a little bit of a difference of emphasis between the way that you put it and the way that I would put it. And the difference of emphasis turns, I think, on this notion of obedience, right?
Mm,
I think obedience is not, as it were, the first step towards becoming a better person. It could be,
mm,
right? But I think a different first step is what I called earlier insight, right?
mm.
Recognizing, and I think we can see this in people's lives, right? Recognizing that the way that you're doing it is just not working out,
Yep,
right? That there's something stifling and insufficient about leading a life that is entirely directed at yourself and the satisfaction of your desires,
right,
or about treating other human beings merely as instruments for the sake of your own sense of entitlement, or doing what you happen to feel like now, right? Even if it's taking drugs and not doing anything of consequence, right? I mean, those lives have a way of making their vices apparent to the
yeah,
people leading them.
yeah,
And that seems to me that the insight that comes from that is an insight that's centered on the notion of fulfillment and flourishing rather than the notion of obedience. I
yeah.
think it can lead us, right, to want to be obedient,
Obedient, right,
right? When we see, oh my gosh, there's a being who loves me and has put me in this world out of love and has created a form of life that's available to me by which I can come to be the full person that I should be, right? I should certainly do what that being wishes me to do.
right.
But I'm not sure that I wouldn't think that that's always the starting point, and I think that in some cases, a more plausible starting point for people is recognition that their life is not going the way that
That it should. Yeah.
I will.
Ca
So can I tell you just a quick story that I mean that
Go ahead.
I because I don't know how this came across the algorithm of my Instagram page, but because I'm not in any way a fan of this group, but I saw an interview with Duff McKagan, maybe his name is, the bassist for Guns N' Roses.
Oh, really?
Yes. Who talked about how, when he was 28, he thought that he was going to live to 30 and then die because all he did was spend all of his time drinking, right? And then one day I guess, pancreas burst and he almost died. And his mother, he found himself in the hospital, and his mother came in. She had Parkinson's disease. I think he's from a large family. And he said he described what happened. He said, I saw myself, as it were, from above the bed, and with my mother in her 70s with Parkinson's disease coming in to see what had happened to her son. And I thought to myself, This is not how it should be. I should be taking care of my mother.
Right.
Right? I should be taking care of myself. I should be taking care of other people. And he said from that moment on, he turned things around, right? He
Yeah.
had a recognition that the way of life, the form of life that he was leading was not in fact conducive to human fulfillment, however much it was satisfying his immediate desires. And it seems
Yeah.
to me that, that recognition was predicated on the kinds of goods that we've been talking about:
Yeah.
love, friendship, recognition of the value of life and health. So I think it's, he had a kind of Thomistic insight,
Right.
uh, presumably without describing it in that way.
Yeah. Kind of like a prodigal son moment.
It was a
Or you're
prodigal
you're
son moment. Yeah.
you're in the pigsty and you realize this is
Oh
not where
goodness,
I
this
should
is
be.
not. Yeah, this is not.
Yeah.
Things are not working out.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's true. I also think that there are times when Lewis has this quote that C.S. Lewis has this quote that obedience is the great opener of eyes. And I think that, for instance, if you look at a child and his mother says, "No, don't stick the fork in the outlet," right?
Yeah.
If he obeys and he doesn't stick the fork in the outlet, one day he will learn. Maybe later that day he will learn. His mother will tell him, or his father will tell him, the reason you don't do that is because it'll shock you and the circuit breakers will snap and it'll be a whole disaster. But if he just puts the fork in there first, he learns, he has insight, but he's also now put his family all in the dark. So I think there's both of those things happen at the same time, or can happen at the same time, but both stories can happen.
Yeah, I guess let me push back just a tiny little bit because I agree with everything that you said, right? But why do you think the kid obeys his parents?
Um, because he knows, because they have spanked it into him that he must,
That's
that
one
this is,
possibility,
yeah.
right? But I think if you're a parent and you're raising kids, and this is something that my wife feels very strongly about with regard to our kids, right? Is that she would much prefer that their initial inclination to do what she asks come out of love for her
Hmm.
than fear of her,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And I think that is often that's not an unreasonable aspiration as a parent, and is probably reflective of a lot of why children do what their parents tell them to do is out of love for their parents
Right.
rather than out of a sort of fearful need
A
to
fear.
obey.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're correct. Yeah. No, I think you're right. When we're talking about morality, there's the question of like, does morality does a person's ethics or moral code change based on their abilities?
Well, I don't think the general judgments about what morality is and what morality requires should change on the basis of your abilities. But I do think that the particular judgments that you should make for you about what's morally required of you are dependent on your abilities in a certain respect. So here I think is a moral norm that I think is important. Um, I said that there are a wide variety of goods. They give us lots of opportunities for action. If you just went and pursued at any given moment whichever of the different opportunities for goodness presented itself to you as the one that you really wanted to do right now,
Hmm.
right? So that today you're reading Shakespeare and tomorrow you're playing cornhole, and then the next day you're playing an instrument, and then you're
Right.
whatever. Then I think your life would be really deficient with regard to the goods. You would never achieve excellence with regard to any particular good. You would never have any significant relationships with other people.
Hmm.
Your life would be kind of chaotic and disordered. And so we need to introduce larger scale commitments into our life, both to persons and to goods, in order to make possible sort of deeper and more excellent pursuit of goods over time. And we could think of that at one level as a kind of way of thinking vocationally about your life, right? How can I bring order into my pursuit of the goods? How can I bring order through commitments that I make?
Mm.
And I think the commitments that you make obviously need to be shaped in part, not exclusively, but in part by an awareness of what you're capable of doing, right? If I decided that I had wasted my time, my life so far as a philosopher, and that what I really needed to do now was to pursue a life based around professional basketball and getting into the NBA, right, I would be making a big mistake, right?
Yeah.
That seems obvious to me, right? I think, we live in a culture where people are often told that they can do whatever they have a deep passion for.
Mm,
This is obviously false, right?
right.
It can be helpful to have a passion for something, but there's lots of things that people are passionate about that they're not actually very good at, and that there's really no hope that they'll ever be particularly good at it. So you need to think about what it is that you have gifts for, right? You can think about the parable of the talents if you're thinking about that, and
Hmm.
what you have opportunities for, and what
Right.
people have a need for, and what you might have a passion for, right? But I think what you are capable of, what gifts you've been given, really should play a central role in how it is that you think that you should order your life. So it doesn't change the most general moral norms. I think everybody needs to think about their lives vocationally, but
Right.
it does mean that the way that you think about your life vocationally is going to be very different from the way that I think about my life vocationally, or the way that Caitlin Clark thinks about her life vocationally, or, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
Different gifts mean different lives.
Yeah. And you have to at some point, because that question of like, do I pursue my passions first and then everything else will kind of follow, is it is unrealistic, but also unfulfilling, I think, in the long term, because I think that if you do the right thing, so you get up every day and you do your job as a UPS driver, even though you may have a passion to be a professional golfer, because being a UPS driver is what pays the bills and keeps the lights on and keeps the family full. I think that is in in a way much more fulfilling. I think it is much more fulfilling than pursuing professional golf, if given that you don't have the ability
Given
to
that you
make
don't have the
it.
ability to do that. Yeah. No,
Right.
I think there's an important good in doing good work. But that also requires that you give some thought to what's the work that you could do well.
Yeah. Um, One last question about morality, and then this is all kind of about morality. But when we're talking about morality, there are goods and there are bads, right? You should honor your mother, honor your father and mother. You should not murder people, right? As far as gray areas go, when people come across things that are not super clear, what's the right way to go about deciphering? Okay, what's the right thing to do here? What's the wrong thing to do here? How do I balance this?
I think it depends on the kind of gray area it is. I think there's different kinds of gray areas. So there are certainly gray areas for people when it comes to thinking vocationally, right? You might have
Hmm.
multiple skills, you might have multiple opportunities. And so you're going to need to do some real discerning in order to, and sometimes it might be the case that it doesn't seem that there's one right answer, right? That you have different possibilities that you could genuinely just freely choose between, and either would be right. Although once you choose one, it's going to make things a lot less gray, right? If you
Mm.
choose to marry this person rather than that person,
Right.
that has real consequences for the gray area, right? There's a lot less gray
Yep.
moving forward.
Yeah.
I think in other cases we have general positive obligations, like we have obligations to care for the poor, and there is a gray area in the sense that it's underdetermined or somewhat indeterminate how we should fulfill those, right?
Mm.
What's the way that like, given my opportunities and given where I am in life and the resources that I have, how is it that I should fulfill my positive obligations to care for the poor? Um, that's gonna Some of that thinking is going to be similar to vocational thinking. I'm going to need to think about the particular opportunities that I have for taking care of people that
Right.
might be very different from yours. And then I think there's a different kind of moral norm, and this might lead us into some of the other things that I know you want to talk about. It's a different kind of moral norm that you mentioned. It is a norm against doing certain things, right?
Mm.
Such as the norm against lying,
Right.
right? And these norms, or we could talk the norm against adultery. These norms identify a particular kind of action, independent of any moral judgment, and then add a moral judgment to the effect of this kind of action is never to be done, right? You're
Mm.
never, so for instance, you're never to kill an innocent human being deliberately, right? You're never to intend the death of an
To
innocent
murder.
human
Yeah.
being. which I think, yeah, to murder. Um, in one sense, there's no gray area there, right? There, it's unlike the norm that tells you that you should feed the poor, where it's unclear and a little bit gray when you should do that, how you should do that, which poor person you should help, how you should help that, right? This
Hmm.
is pretty straightforward. Here's something that you should never do. But of course, there are also a different kind of gray areas in many of these questions because you need to understand what a lie is. You need to understand whether this thing that you're thinking about saying would in fact be a lie or not. Sometimes that's not so straightforwardly clear. In the case
Hmm.
of killing, you need to understand which, of the various things that might or might not be human beings, which really are human beings, so that I have an obligation never to kill them, never to intend their death. Um, there's a different kind of gray area there, but
Yeah.
it's not the gray area of it being indeterminate what you should do, right? In the way it is with the norm that you should feed the poor or care for the poor. It's
Right.
indeterminate in the sense that there's still some factual premises that you need to work out in order to be able to fully follow that particular norm. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That does that. There are different kind of gray areas, and some gray areas are bounded by black, surrounded by
Oh yeah,
black and white,
certainly.
right? And they become instantly not gray the moment you make a decision. Um, yeah.
Well, so I mean, yes, but some are not gray even before you make a decision, right? I mean,
Also absolutely true. Yeah. Yes. When we're so you mentioned lying a little bit. You wrote a book about lying in Christian ethics.
mhm.
Also one other thing I wanted to add when we were talking about the children obeying their parents because they love them. I do think that's the goal, but I think it does start out as you obey dad because you know that if you don't, he's going to spank you. Um,
I think that I think it's a complicated question. I mean, I so my oldest daughter has six children. She lives in the house next door to me. She has six children, so I have six grandchildren living next door to me who
have
are
fun.
11 to 8 months, right? So I get to see the whole. I mean, from a little bit of a distance. When you're parenting, it's just too frazzling to even think about what's going
Right. Right.
And I don't know. I mean, a 1 year old, a toddler really has a desire to do what mom and dad want, and they've never been spanked,
Mm,
right? I think that there is, I mean, that's not to deny, I mean, Augustine, I think, is very, very, very prudent, very wise on how even infants have, the fallen state of human beings can be witnessed in young children. But it is also the case that young children demonstrate um, real social orientations, I think, towards their parents and the people around them that play a big role in shaping their behavior
yeah.
before spankings ever become like a plausible thing.
Right. Yeah. I think that's sometimes true. You see kids who like their mom says, "Go clean up the toys," and there are some moments when the kids are like, "Okay, I love you, mom. I'm gonna go clean up the toys." But there are other moments when they're like, "Well, I was building a castle
Oh yeah.
with my Lego bricks, and I would like to keep the toys out," and mom says no, and then so there's two moments. But then they're completely different. But in one, the kid obeys either before or after spankings because before or after discipline because the mom says to and because there's a fear of discipline at some level. And then in the other situation, it's because there's a full love for mom, and I think there can be both
Yeah. No, I
in
think
the
the picture
child at the same
includes
time.
a plausible picture has to include both sets of inclinations.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about lying. You wrote a book called "Lying in Christian Ethics," in which, if I'm understanding it correctly, you outlined the belief that you should never ever lie. Am I getting that correct?
I didn't outline it. I proved it.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding. Yes, I argued for it. That was the
Yeah.
position that I took and still hold. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, can you kind of walk me through the process? How'd you come to that conclusion?
Yeah. I guess there were maybe three things that were central to it. One was becoming more aware, which is an awareness that I think has been lost to most Christians of just how central this teaching was to an enormous part of the history of Christianity. Right?
Hmm.
From Augustine on for well over 1,000 years, this is just what Christians thought. Right? They thought that it was always wrong to lie.
Hmm.
Augustine is very forceful on this. His writings are, I think, amazing He wrote two essays on lying. One is called On Lying, and the other is called Against Lying. They're both against lying.
Yeah.
Very powerful essays, and that was the position of Christians in the West at any rate, um, for well over 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And you still see traces of it even in the 20th century. I think it's become largely lost to Christianity. But becoming aware of just how centrally, central to the Christian self-understanding that was for such a long time, I think is an important thing to remember, right? And thinking about it. A second thing that I think is important, and this also I think will probably track a lot of people's, I mean, for me to be the person who argues that lying is always wrong isn't because, I think that I never lie or I'm never inclined to lie or tempted to lie.
Right.
I think this is like one of the most profoundly difficult moral norms. It's pretty to follow, right? It's pretty easy. How many times have you been tempted to kill somebody? Very few is going to be my guess, right?
Yeah.
How many times have you been tempted to lie? It could be
A
on a
lot
daily
more.
basis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just such a constant and pervasive feature of our life, which is a little bit strange. But it's also something that, I mean, from my very earliest youth, when I was not thinking about these things philosophically and certainly had no understanding of what the Christian tradition was, always, whenever I would lie, always gave me a sense that I was both kind of coming apart a little bit in doing so, that there was something, now I would talk about it as a failure of integrity, but then it just seemed like, I need to put myself back together again.
Yeah.
And that it always put me at a distance from whoever it was that I had lied to, right? That there
Hmm.
was a violation of my relationship with that person. I think both
Right.
of those thoughts are, turn out to then to be central to the argument that I make in that book. And then the third thing is, just becoming more philosophically aware and reading the relatively small handful of people who have written on this from an Augustinian or a Thomistic perspective, and finding their arguments pretty persuasive, right?
Yeah.
It's not a huge literature, but I think it's a pretty interesting literature and one worth spending some time on.
Yeah. Um, uh, when you're thinking about these things, can you kind of define lying a little bit? Because there are it's got there's some I think there's a little bit of definition work that needs to be
There
done.
definitely is. There absolutely. I mean that work. One of the things that's very interesting to me philosophically is that right now there's a lot of work being done by philosophers who have no interest in Christianity and not much familiarity with the tradition, but they're very interested in this question about what a lie is, what the definition of a lie is,
Right.
and they go to Augustine, right? They recognize that the conversation has to take Augustine into account. Augustine has what's considered the classic definition, I would say, that to lie is to assert something that is contrary to your mind, contrary to what you think, with the intention to deceive.
Okay.
And the definition that I would accept is a little bit simpler than that. And I think this is Aquinas's definition, and I think it's a definition that contemporary philosophers are more inclined now to move towards. And that's simply that to lie is to assert or to affirm, right? When I assert something, I'm affirming its truth to you.
Right.
To lie is to affirm the truth of something when it's not actually what I believe to be true.
Hmm.
Right? And it's not necessary when I do that that it might well be the case that I'm affirming something to you without ever thinking that you're going to change your mind, right? And so I might not be intending to deceive you in the sense of getting you to come to believe something false, except in
Right.
this respect, right? That I think it is always the case if I'm lying to somebody that I am trying to get them to think that I think differently than what I do.
Yeah.
Right? If I
Yeah.
was, if you had some special machine that could always tell what I was thinking, then I think that, and I knew that, I don't think it
Yeah.
would be possible for me to lie to you.
Right. Yeah. Um, there's from what I see two different kinds of lying. There's lying to a friend or an ally, right? So, for instance, I lied to my boss about how many hours I was in the office, right? Uh, that's one kind of lying, and can. Um, I think everyone can say no on like a gut level. I think there's a biblical precedent for why that's wrong, which is the Bible says thou shalt not lie. But I think that most people can say that's wrong. There might be some people there who say like, "Oh, well, I'm lying because it's going to benefit my human flourishing, and it's not going to really hurt the other person." What would your kind of response be to that
Yeah.
objection?
Uh, I mean, there are different kinds of lies. I think that those kinds of lies often track differences of gravity, right? So that some of these lies are more significantly wrong, let's say, than others. But I don't think this Aquinas, Augustine and Aquinas think this too. I mean, Augustine has this. I think he divides 9 categories of lie, right? Lies that don't hurt anybody and help somebody, lies that do hurt somebody but also help somebody, lies that only hurt somebody. Uh, there's a whole bunch of different, including what to Augustine's mind is the worst kind of lie, the most gravely serious, is a lie in regard to religious matters.
Hmm.
So for Augustine, I mean, the reason that Augustine wades into this question in the first place is that there is a heretical sect, the Priscillianists,
Yep.
who pretend to be, good Christians, and good Christians pretend to be Priscillianists in order to infiltrate them and root them out, and that involves lying to them. And Augustine is very opposed to this practice, right? And you
Hmm.
might think, well, but isn't this for the best possible cause, right? They're trying to preserve Christianity and to root out heresy and to preserve the faith. And Augustine says, no, this is the worst kind of lie, to lie in matters having to do with faith and
Yeah.
religion. I think the question of gravity, right, how serious a lie is or not, is different from the simple binary question of whether it's permissible or not, right? So for me, the switch is always on no, right? Should you lie, right? But then it can be in various different places with regard to how serious a wrong it is.
Hmm.
That is a little, that makes lying maybe a little bit different from killing, right?
Right.
But not necessarily. I think that there's also clearly differences of gravity between, right, killing your parent in order to get the inheritance in cold blood versus, you know, euthanasia of a loved one who is asking for it and seems to be in great pain. I think that's still wrong. I think both of these are morally wrong. You shouldn't do either of them.
Yeah.
But maybe the gravity of the second is a little bit less than the gravity of the first. Um, And so it might not be the case that lying is completely different from that. But yeah, no, my view is that lying is always and everywhere wrong, at all times, in all cultures. Not every culture obviously agrees with that. The social mores are again very different on lying.
Yeah.
Um, but that's just a separate question from the question of the gravity of the thing.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes sense. And the going back to Augustine and the Priscillians and the Christians trying to infiltrate. Why did he say that religious matters were the worst possible lie?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think this is, I mean, for me, reading Augustine on this was a little bit mind blowing, frankly, and really illuminating as to both how he thinks and about the nature of lying. It's because the central claims of Christianity are claims about truth, right?
Hmm.
I mean, the if the Gospels are made up stories, like many biblical historians would want you to think, right? If they're just made up stories, or if even if they involve some bits of made up story and other bits of truth, if they're anything other than the 100% true affirmations of things that in fact happened involving this man, Jesus Christ, then the whole foundation of faith crumbles, right?
Right.
The whole reason that we have for being Christians is because we take the earliest affirmations of the Christian church to be fully and 100% true.
Mm.
But that means that we have to maintain incredible trustworthiness in on the part of those persons who are passing on those truths from generation to generation. And Augustine is
Hmm.
really concerned that if you have Christians who are lying for the sake of the faith, that's going to open it up to people who are doubtful of the faith to say, well, if you think that it's okay to lie for the sake of the faith, why shouldn't we think that the earliest apostles and disciples of Jesus were also lying for the sake of this
The
religion?
faith. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have to have we have to have complete trustworthiness, right, on the part of those relaying the message so that people can be completely trustworthy so that they can have faith on the part of the people who are receiving the message. And so Augustine just thinks that it's incredibly damaging to Christianity to have its proponents lying for a good cause, because it just threatens to, like, expose the entire thing as a corruption back to the beginning.
Mm, yeah.
Exposed is
And
the wrong word, because that would suggest that it is a corruption. It threatens to lead people to think that it's a
that
corruption.
is corruption. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's I think that's a great point that he makes, and you're expounding on that. Um, I do. This leads into kind of a broader question about like when there are some people who believe that it is okay to lie in cases of war, and so like war kind of throws a lot of um, some a lot of ethics maybe, but the ethics kind of shift, how God views our actions in war shifts from how he views them in peacetime. So, for instance, if I'm going to war with another country, and it's a just war, as Augustine would call it, a just war, um, and I kill someone on the from the enemy, Christian, I think the Bible would say that that is. I think the Bible's pretty clear that that's uh, okay. It's not to be preferred, but I think it's okay. And so this question about lying also comes up, because you see people like, for instance, when the Midianites are oppressing Israel in the Old Testament, and Gideon is they're taxing Israel. I think they were taxing Israel some enormous amount. Gideon um, rolled out the wheat and separated the wheat from the chaff on the wine press, so that he would not have to pay as high of a tax to the Midianites. So
Mhm.
the question is like, is that lying? Is that like, where does that fall? Is that, what's the ethics of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot packed in there.
Yeah, sorry.
Um, so this question about whether important figures in the Old Testament, especially, but also in one place in the New Testament, whether they lied, right, is something that really bothers Augustine and Aquinas, right? They both think that they need to excuse biblical figures from the accusation of lying. So they're very
Mm,
concerned, for instance, about Abraham saying that Sarah is his
right,
cousin rather than his wife.
right.
Uh, and their view, they're both of them, I mean, they both agree on this. Well, it's true, right? She was, so it's misleading, but it's not a lie. And the one New Testament thing, and well, I mean, so they both talk about the Egyptian midwives
Hmm.
lying to Pharaoh,
Yeah,
and they both say, in that case, they want to say who were, and who were given a reward by God. They say,
right.
well, they did lie. They lied out of a good motive, and they were rewarded for the good motive, but their reward was only an earthly reward, because what they did was also wrong, right? So they've got, they
Mm,
think that they need to address this. There is a question about Jesus, when he makes as if to go on um, further on the road to Emmaus. Is that a lie? I think both Augustine and Aquinas would say no, because it doesn't actually involve an assertion. So, right. So, but this is there's an interpretive question about the Bible. If you think that lying is always wrong, how far do you have to go in order to exculpate various people from this? And then there is also, I think you're absolutely correct to put your finger on this. There is a puzzle, because both Augustine and Aquinas make a distinction between what is permissible to private persons in the domain of killing and what's
hmm.
permissible to those with civil authority. And both take it to be the case that it's permissible for those with civil authority to intend death, right? For instance, in execution.
Right.
Both hold that it is always wrong for a private person under any circumstance to intend death of anybody, right?
Hmm.
So Augustine seems to be denying that you can even use force, if it might be lethal, in order to protect your life if you're under unjust assault.
Mm.
And Aquinas introduces, I mean, this is a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's an important,
Yeah, go
they're
ahead.
important weeds. Aquinas says, no, what Augustine is saying is that you can't intend death to the person who's attacking you, but it's permissible to use force to repel that person, even if you foresee that as a side effect, death might come to that person,
Right.
right? And so Aquinas thinks that in the realm of private persons, the only lethal force that's permissible is lethal force that happens as a side effect.
Yeah.
But
Interesting.
he thinks that for people with public authority, right, doesn't have to be a side effect, right? They can choose to kill, right? And that capital when people are carrying out a capital sentence, they are choosing to kill, and when people are going to war, they're choosing to kill. And
Yeah.
I think that raises a puzzle. I'm really sorry. As I mentioned by email, I first came down with laryngitis, but it was only so that I could then get a cold.
Very sorry. No, you're totally fine.
They have this interestingly divided view, and it raises a puzzle. I think it raises a couple of different puzzles. And one is, well, if they think this about killing, why don't they also think this about lying? Why
Mm,
don't they think that public authorities have authority to lie? Maybe private persons don't, right? But why not think that since public authority have authority to kill, that they
right.
also have authority to lie?
Yeah.
Um, I think so I want to say I'll say just two things about this, right? One is that I think that their reasons ultimately are for not making that distinction are biblical, right? That they think that it's just obvious. They take this from Paul, right? St. Paul says this, that God doesn't lie,
Right.
and that the model for civil authority and what it is allowed to do that differentiates it from private persons is a biblical model, right?
Mm,
That if there's something that God just doesn't do, right, then that's not something that we should claim as special for civil authority,
yeah.
right? And so I think that's a deep part of their thinking about why there isn't this special. I mean, because on the surface of it, although I think this could be qualified in a variety of different ways, on the surface of it, it does look like God kills, um, right?
Right.
But it doesn't look like, but they're committed to the view that God never lies, right?
Right.
Now, so that's the first thing I'd say is, right, why don't they draw this distinction? And because it just seems clear to them that that's not something that God does, and so civil authority can't inherit that kind of authority from God in the way that it looks like civil authority can inherit the authority to kill.
Hmm.
Um, just as a kind of side note, I will say that I have my own additional doubts about that way that Augustine and Aquinas divide things, even with regard to killing, right?
Mm,
And you could see, I think it's a kind of unstable distinction. I think you see the instability. I think most Christians think, for instance, that if I am attacking you, right, that you can use lethal force in response and intend to kill me.
right.
Right? I think that's become a standard view because of this instability of thinking that private persons can't do it, but public people with public authority can.
Mm,
But I think actually the instability should be resolved in the other direction. Um, just as it's wrong for both private persons and persons with public authority to lie, I think it is also wrong for private persons and people with public authority to intend death, and that the only permissible killing is killing that happens as a side effect. And I'll just say that 9 months, 10 months from now, I'm hoping that the sequel to Lying and Christian Ethics will come out with the same press, with Cambridge University Press, and it's called Killing in Christian Ethics.
got
Uh,
it.
and that's
Okay.
where I make that argument.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so let's unpack that final bit.
Sure.
The lying is not permissible both in private and in public persons, and this is like across the board,
Yep.
never permissible. Um, do you make any distinctions? So I think you brought up in the book the situation of German people who were hiding Jews from the Nazis, and the Nazi asks like, do you have Jews in your house? Do you have Jews under the floorboard, under the couch,
Yep.
right? And I don't. What were your kind of your thoughts around that, and did anything change in time of war?
Yeah. So there's a difference. I think it's important to see the narrow claim that I'm making, which is that it's always wrong to lie, right? And that's different from saying that you should always tell the truth. Right? There's
Mm,
lots of circumstances in which it is true both that you shouldn't lie and that it would be wrong for you to reveal the truth to somebody, right? You've
right.
promised to keep something secret. Well, you can't lie about it if I'm right
Yeah.
about lying, but you've also promised to keep it secret, so you shouldn't just go blabbing, right, the truth.
Yeah.
And so I think, I mean, my answer which is not a perfect answer because there is no perfect answer when you're dealing with Nazis, right, who are notoriously unreasonable and wicked.
Yep.
Um, my answer is that anytime a Nazi asks you a question about whether you're hiding Jews, right, you have an authority, you have an obligation not to tell them the truth, right? They
Hmm.
have no genuine authority with regard to you. And there are good reasons, I think. And I think had everybody thought this, then things might have been different to some extent, and maybe to a great extent in Germany. There are good reasons to resist the authority, the claims to authority that Nazis made. And one way that you do that is by saying, "Look, I'm just not going to answer that question, right? I whether I do or whether I don't answer questions about whether I'm hiding Jews from people who are unjustly seeking them.
Yeah.
No, things might have gone bad for you, right? You probably at least would have been, knocked around a bit, and then they would have
Yeah.
searched your house. And let's
They would
say
have
that
probably assumed that you had Jews based off that answer.
that's right. And then so let's assume that they knock you around a little bit and search your house, and you're not, and this is your principle, right? This is what you say every time. So they've maybe come two or three times and done this, and each time
Right.
they haven't found anybody, and they now just think of that you're a troublemaker. And so when you say it the third or fourth time, maybe they just knock you around and don't bother to search because they've been through this routine before. And maybe this is the time that you are hiding Jews in your basement.
Hmm.
Um, I think that is a way of adopting a particular strategy of both political protest and not lying that covers not just times that you're hiding Jews in the basement, but also times that you're not hiding Jews in the basement. Is it perfect? No, right? But of
Mm.
course,
Yeah.
people who lied, right, also were not adopting a perfect approach because Nazis don't believe
Right.
people, right?
Yeah.
And so they're likely to search your house, even if you're lying to them when you're hiding Jews, and bad consequences will ensue. So I think it's
Right.
important to find a principled approach
Yeah.
um, that maybe in some cases will also bear some good fruit, but that manages to uphold what you think is genuinely morally true.
Yeah. And this begs the question of like, so what does lying do that is the reason it is prohibited in the Bible? It's prohibited in most scriptural, in most religious texts, uh, apart from the Bible, but obviously the Bible being the authoritative text. But lying is like always seen as bad. And so the question is what is bad about it? And I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier that one of the things lying does is it degrades your own fabric,
Mhm.
the fabric of your own nature, and it also degrades the fabric of trust, the fabric of society, and the fabric of the relationship you have with someone else. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty close. So on the second point first, I mean, it's not strictly a trust. I mean, I think trust is important here, but I think there's an even more foundational thought, which is that human communion, human sociality, human friendship is a basic good. It's one of these goods that I mentioned earlier. And I
Hmm.
think, and we didn't talk a lot about this, but I think one of the norms of morality is that you should never intend damage or harm to any such good. And I think that affirmation, assertion, right, is the first moment of any genuine community. Right? If you and I are in some form of community, then we have to have an understanding of each other's minds as a preface to a shared will, right? I think sharing a will, right, a will towards some good that we take to be in common is what's necessary for us to be in some form of community, right? You and I right now are we share certain goals and certain ends and certain goods insofar as we're having a conversation, but that only gets off the ground by you communicating something to me about so I will tell you, I mean, because I think this is illustrative. You sent me a link to your
Hmm.
podcast, which I didn't look at. I just said yes, right? But yesterday I went and clicked the link and didn't find it. Now I
Yes. Sorry, I changed the
right,
name.
right, right. But for a moment I thought, this who is this guy who has presented himself under false pretenses as
Yes.
running a podcast that doesn't even exist, right? What I thought, I mean, I'm exaggerating for the sake of making the point, right?
Yeah.
What it seemed to me was a genuine community, right? One in which you initiate a particular kind of offer to me and I respond. Right
Right.
now, I have this moment of doubt because maybe you weren't who you said you were, or what you didn't weren't doing what you said you were doing.
Yeah.
That seems to me what happens in a lie. I I offer a form of communication to you. I offer an affirmation of something as true to you. It's not
Yeah.
actually what I think. And
Right.
so rather than sort of, as it were, making a gift of something that I think to you, I'm presenting it as if I'm doing that for you to respond affirmatively, but I'm
Yeah.
actually not doing that in reality. And so I'm offering the opportunity of a particular kind of community and blocking it right then and there.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to violate this norm that I mentioned about not intentionally damaging instances of basic goods.
Yeah. Uh, I think a lot of people would hear that and their immediate response would be, right, but they're a Nazi, so we already don't have community, the community that we do have has been destroyed by their going and searching for the Jews, right? And so there's a break of trust there. There's a break of their social fabric, their nature has been destroyed by the sin that is eating them up. And therefore, because they have already broken this community, it is not, it would not be immoral for us to act on the premises that we live in. That this community between me and this Nazi is a broken one.
Mhm. That's right. And I think there is something right about that. There's something right about that in the sense that your obligations to pursue community are limited with the Nazis. I
Hmm.
don't think that they're non-existent, but I do
Mm,
think that they're quite limited, right? But what happens in a lie is that you extend the offer to do exactly that, right?
yeah,
So if you remain silent, right? If you say I'm not answering any questions, um, if you run away and hide, if you I mean there's a million different things that you might do
right.
that are not making an offer of community to the Nazi, and I think that are probably quite justified. But
Hmm.
when you begin the affirmation, no, I'm not hiding anybody, when in fact you are, or anything else, right, that you might be, when you begin any affirmation to them, on my view, you are actually then taking that first step of offering them a form of communion, right? It's
Mm,
different from not pursuing it. It's one thing to not pursue community with another person. Sometimes you have very good reasons, right? There's lots of people, I assume, like within a mile of where I am, that I could go and start talking to right now, but I have good reason not to do that because I've made it
right,
to you. Um, but that's very different from my going up to any of those persons and lying to them, right? If I
right.
go up to them and make an affirmation, then I've offered them, right? I've
Yeah,
made the offer of a particular kind of communion with them and then violated it in the same act.
yeah,
That seems to me a different thing.
yeah, yeah. And like you're pulling the rug out from under them.
Yeah.
They are you are almost creating a vulnerability within them and then exploiting it.
I think that's exactly right. I
Yeah.
mean, in fact, I've never put it that way and I've never heard it put exactly that way, but it's a very nice way to put it because our our need for both communion and truth is a kind of vulnerability, right? And there's a way in which I like that expression of, exploiting a vulnerability in another when we lie. It's
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah. Um, and this goes for because um, that's a personal lie. I lie to you. Um, I changed the name of my podcast, and so you're unable to find it. Um, but then there's
I didn't actually panic, so it was an
well,
illustration of.
that's good to know. Did you end up finding it?
I did eventually find it. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. But so there's that, and then um, and I really like that distinction between lies of commission and lies of omission.
Well, I don't
It-
want to
it-
say that the omissions are lies, right?
right,
That I think
that's
is the
that's
important
what you're
thing,
saying.
right?
Yeah. Um, but then there's the question of like when it comes to England interacting with Germany, I would assume you would say that it's the same thing, where
Mhm.
you have to realize that like um, you are you are almost creating reaching out to create a community, or not in England's case, not creating a community with Germany in the Second World War, but then also not creating a vulnerability and exploiting it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that it's important to see that throughout a large part of the history of warfare and thinking about the ethics of warfare and the ethics of diplomatic relationships with between countries, perfidy, right? Say the making of a promise and then the breaking of the promise is
Hmm.
viewed as very, very wrong, right?
Right.
I mean, it is the case that countries at war generally follow, not always, because sometimes people and countries do things that are very, very wrong, but are expected to follow the norm that treaties are to be kept, the promises are to be kept, that if you say we're going to not fight tomorrow and then you go and make an attack tomorrow, that you've done something really specially wrong. It's very
Right.
different from, from creating uh, the appearance of an invasion over here when you actually plan to do an invasion over here. That's not an affirmation. But if
Right.
I promise you, if I cross enemy lines and say tomorrow's Christmas and we're not going to attack you, and then do attack you, right? That's considered an especially egregious violation of the
Yeah.
norms of war.
Yeah, and there's a question of like means and ends that comes in here too, because there are some people that would say, right, well, we're okay lying to the Nazis, in order to like we're okay telling them we're not going to attack on Christmas Eve and then going and attacking on Christmas Eve because it serves the greater good, which is the destruction of the Nazi Party, the Third Reich, right? So. In that situation, when someone says like, okay, this is a question of means and ends, and we believe that the ends justifies the means, which is lying and kind of destroying our own fabric, in the lie, but that's okay. It's the cost we have to make in order to destroy them. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, the first response is again to point out that, in fact, countries are very resistant to doing that. Um, I think that it does go by the name of perfidy, and the understanding of the wrong of perfidy in military ethics runs really deep. Right?
Mm,
It does raise the larger question, which you're pointing to, as to whether situations of extremity or situations of so-called necessity or situations in which the consequences that could happen are very, very bad are situations in which what I called earlier these negative absolute norms, right, saying such as the norm that you should never lie, whether there's some sort of override for those norms in situations of grave, what you might think of as grave necessity. And I think that the doctrine of moral absolutes, the thought that there are such things as moral absolutes, which I think is a part of the Christian tradition,
hmm.
is it the thought, the doctrine is that those norms are not to be violated, period. Right.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in the New Testament, the one person that you find making an argument of exactly that parallels exactly the sort of argument that you've just described, right? That the end is so significant that it would justify doing something that would otherwise be wrong is Caiaphas, right?
Hmm.
Who says, well, isn't it better that one innocent person should be killed than that the whole polity suffer?
Right.
Um, I don't think it's an accident that I mean, I don't think he's being put forth in the gospel as the hero of that particular story.
No. No, not
Um,
really.
I think it is just a basic part of Christian ethics that there are some things that you're called upon never to do. And there's an expectation in Christian ethics that sometimes that will result in the need for great sacrifice and great suffering on your part.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's I want to quickly touch on transitioning this same conversation over to killing and kind of previewing your upcoming book, and then we'll leave it there. This all that you have said thus far, I think I would agree with, and Corey Ten Boom most definitely did
Yes.
agree with you. I mean, she famously she would go probably farther than you in that she would tell the Nazis, yes, there are Jews under the carpet, and
Well,
then the
not Corey. Your
Nazis.
sister Nolly
was
actually
it
is the
Nolly? Okay, there
one.
you
Yeah.
go. But when it comes to killing, I believe you made the claim that it is always wrong to seek the death of another. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That you
To
said
intend.
that? Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Um, that I'm curious how you reconcile that, how that works with the fact that God clearly sanctioned and um, more than sanctioned, blessed people like David and the kings of Israel going out and conquering and killing other nations. And even in the case of Saul and the Amalekites,
Yep.
Saul was told to absolutely, like, obliterate them completely. And the fact that he didn't was the reason that God turned his face away from Saul. How do you kind of
Yeah. Yeah,
reconcile
so
that?
that's the $1 million question. It's one that I'm just going to say up front that I'm absolutely not competent. I'm just a humble philosopher. But pretty clearly, there's a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament in terms of the genre that is being
Hmm.
made use of, right? I think the genre of the New Testament is the genre of history, right? It's the genre of these are things that happened. We're honest and reliable witnesses to them, and we testify to their truth. Whereas the Old Testament, right, is full of many different genres, right?
Right.
And I think if you now this is going to be a disputed claim among various different Christian groups, but if you read every single passage in the Old Testament in exactly the same way, then I think you would be led to believe
Some,
things that are not
yep,
true,
yep.
right? And so and yet for many centuries, and again, including some Christians now, but certainly a minority of them, right? For many centuries, the first um, few chapters of Genesis were read in a particular way with regard to something like the relative position of the earth and the sun, right?
Hmm.
Um, and at the time when that was being then debated because there was new evidence, but it wasn't really strong enough evidence to show for certain that the earth revolved around the sun. Galileo, one of the big defenders of heliocentrism, went to Cardinal Bellarmine, who was right in charge of exercising discipline in the Catholic Church, and said, "Hey, come on, we got to make this we got to make the claim that the Earth revolves around the sun." And in a very
Hmm.
famous letter, Bellarmine said, in responding to some points that Galileo made, said, "Well, look, we've always interpreted Scripture in this way, in this very straightforward way. We've got lots of reasons to do so. Um, and so it's irresponsible for you to say that we should now all of a sudden stop, right? But if it were the case that you had proof that the earth revolved around the sun, then what we would have to say is not that the scriptures were mistaken, but that we had been mistaken in the way that we were understanding them.
Hmm.
And I think that holds here, right? I do think within the Catholic Church, for instance, and then within some other denominations within Christianity, there is a movement towards this view that I described as, I think, a more consistent view than the one that's held by Augustine and Aquinas.
Yeah.
Um, I think if the church were to move in that direction and if sound philosophical thinking were to move people in that direction, then Bellarmine's this claim that Bellarmine made would be very important to us. We would need to say, well, we've understood these passages, right, in which God seems to act or to command action of the Jewish people of a particular sort, right? The mistake is not with Scripture, but with our understanding of Scripture, and we need to understand Scripture in light of right our more recent recognition of what's actually true in this case.
Yeah, yeah, and even I don't remember who says it, but someone says, "For our weapons are not carnal, but mighty for the tearing down of strongholds." When someone brings up the idea of why don't we just like go to war with this person? But God is the same yesterday, today, and forever is the assertion, and He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and He is the same in the Old Testament as He is in the
Yeah,
New
that's
Testament.
right.
And so I maybe we'll leave it here. I am very interested to see how you reconcile that the God of the Old Testament is the same God as the God of the New Testament. Um, at the same time, Christ did not come and defeat the Roman armies with his own army, and also at the same time. The Bible, the New Testament does not seem to in some areas the New Testament says kind of um, the new covenant has fulfilled some things in the old covenant, and we see that very visibly. It does not seem to me to have fulfilled the uh, the necessity to defend yourself and to use violence in times of war. Um, and
Yeah, it's an
you
interesting
know,
observation.
I'll be very interested to see how you kind of reconcile, bring this whole conversation together when the book comes out. Tell people where they can look for that, when they can look for that,
So it
etc.
should come out in April or May of 2026. It'll be with Cambridge University Press, Killing in Christian Ethics, and I'm really excited about it. That's what I spent the last year. I had a sabbatical last year at the University of Notre Dame and spent it working on that, and I'm excited to see it happen.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll put links in the description. Do you have a website you want people to visit?
Not yet, but
Not yet.
soon.
Coming soon. There you go. I will. I'll put as many links in the description as I can, and I'll update it when the book comes out. So
That's
there
great.
you go. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jackson.
See you guys.